Good morning to one and all. I hope you had a great Halloween and that you remembered to set your clocks back 1 hour. Now this morning we begin with the book of Daniel. Now for a long period of time the prophets had warned the rulers and the people of Judah that their idolatry, that their immorality and injustice to the poor and the needy would lead to the nation's ruin and downfall. Now for 100 plus years before the fall of Jerusalem, Isaiah proclaimed the message in chapters 13 through 39. Now Isaiah's prophecy speaks of a time when Babylon would rise up as a world power and send her armies abroad and against Judah. They began a series of attacks on Judah, deporting its people and the kings from Judah back to Babylon in the year 604 through 587 BC. Then finally in 587 BC, the Babylonians totally destroyed Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the temple and the palace back to Babylon. And this is recorded in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52. Now the people of Judah, lived in exile until 539 BC when the Babylonians were conquered by the Medes and the Persians, and this will be we'll talk about this in Daniel 5:28. Now the prophecy of Judah's downfall and the destruction of Jerusalem is also found in Jeremiah 20 and chapters 25 and 27. Now the prophet Micah gave this prophecy about Judah. It says in Micah 4:10, it says, "Wither in agony, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you must leave the city to camp in the open field. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you out of the hand of your enemies." Now even in Micah it tells about that they're going to be withering in agony and that they're going to be taken away from the city, have to be in the field, have to go to Babylon. And so, but there's also that message of hope about redemption at the hands of their enemy. Now, beginning in Daniel 1:1, it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it." Now, Jehoiakim was one of the last kings of Judah before the Babylon captivity. Jehoiakim was a son of the good king Josiah of Judah. King Josiah had returned Judah to the Lord by tearing down the idols, the shrines, and restoring obedience to the God's law and restoring the temple. After Josiah's death, his son Jehoahaz was chosen king by the people. However, he did not follow in the footsteps of his father, but he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Jehoahaz only reigned 3 months before he was taken into captivity by the king of Egypt, who replaced Jehoahaz with his brother Eliakim. Now, this gets all confusing, but the Egyptian king renamed him Jehoiakim. So that's who we have in place right now. Now, verse 2 goes on to say, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands," talking about Nebuchadnezzar, "with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." How bad was Jehoiakim? In Jeremiah 22:18-22 it says, "Therefore this is what the Lord says about Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. They will not mourn for him. Alas, my brother, alas, my sister. They will not mourn for him. Alas, my master. Alas, alas, his splendor. He will have the burial of a donkey, dragged away and thrown outside the gates of Jerusalem. Go up to Lebanon and cry out. Let your voices be heard in Bashan. Cry out for Abiram, for all your allies are crushed. I warned you when you felt secure, but you said, I will not listen. This has been your way from your youth. You have not obeyed me. The wind will drive all your shepherds away, and your allies will go into exile. Then you will be ashamed and disgraced because of all your wickedness." So Jeremiah predicts the downfall of Jehoiakim, and that he was not obeying God. He was seeking other allies instead of putting his trust in God. So this is why God had him deposed. Now Jehoiakim lacked faith in God. He thought his alliance with Egypt would protect him and Judah from the invading Babylonian army. Now Nebuchadnezzar had a large, well-trained, well-armed army, and possibly When he conquered Judah, he gave credit to his army or to his God for the victory over Judah. Now, the people of the Bible with faith, now there are people in the Bible with faith in God who won battles against greater odds. And that's all God was asking, to have faith and trust and obedience in him, and you would win. Look what Moses did with his faith in God. Look what Gideon did, Joshua did. But Jehoiakim failed to trust and have faith as results, as verse 2 said, the Lord gave Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand. Because of his disobedience and lack of trust and faith, he was given up to Nebuchadnezzar. It also mentions these vessels had been, now those vessels came out of the temple. These are the vessels that had been set aside by Solomon when the temple was built. The cups, the saucers, the plates, all the stuff that was used in the temple itself by the priest. Now, during the time that the vessels had been were in captivity in Babylon, they themselves were defiled by King Belshazzar in Daniel 5, 1 through 4, where it says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them at a banquet for a pagan god. Now in Daniel 5, 3 and 4 it says, so they brought in the goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine. They praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron and wood and stone. So they're praising these false gods with the goblets of wine that were the vessels out of the Hebrew temple. Now, these were taken and stored for over 70 years in Babylonia. But the first group of returning Jews brought them back. In Ezra 1:11 it says, in all there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now in verses 3 and 4 it says, and the king spoke unto Aspenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom there was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had the ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and with whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar is telling the master of the eunuchs to bring up the prettiest, the best looking, the smartest, the strongest, so that they can become part of his administrative officers within his kingdom. Now, the master of his eunuchs, while we understand that the word eunuchs are men who have been castrated and used as servants within the king's palace, now over time, this term, this phrase eunuch, has changed. It came to mean and to refer to high government officials or court officials. The prophecy by Isaiah in Isaiah 39:7 says, and some of your descendants, your flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon, which they did. And the commentaries do not give a 100% opinion on this subject either way, that whether the Daniel and his friends had been castrated or not. There are persuasive arguments both ways. However, Daniel served the Lord, and Jesus said in Matthew 9:12, it says, for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. Meaning that they dedicated their lives to heaven, to God, and were not physically deformed, as the word implies. But whether Daniel was or was not truly a eunuch, by definition, isn't important. In either case, Daniel's life stands as a positive example for other followers of God. He remained faithful to the Lord in a pagan culture, served his leaders and nation well, and impacted the lives of many through his faith and through the revelation of many prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled. So it's not an important part, but there are some commentaries that make it an important part. But that's not the lesson of Daniel. Verse 5 says, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them for 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now, the king is providing these boys. Daniel and his friends are all approximately 15 years old. The king is giving them food from his table, wine. He's providing an education in a university-style setting. Many commentaries say that the Babylonians were actually brainwashing the Hebrew boys, making them dependent upon the Babylonians, putting the Hebrew boys in a position that they needed to show gratitude and loyalty to their masters. Now verses 7 and 6 says, now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave them names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and Mishael, Meshach, and of Azariah of Abednego. Now the first thing done in indoctrination or re-education or reprogramming people is to pull them, when they were pulled into the Babylonian culture, was to change their names, to give them a Babylonian names. These names, Daniel meant God is my judge, but his Babylonian name, Belshazzar, was Bel or Mordak, protect them. Mordak is the god of Babylonia that they would have child sacrifices to. Hananiah's name meant the Lord is gracious, and Shadrach meant inspired by the sun god, a pagan god. Mishael is who is what God is. In other words, who compares to what God is. And Meshach is who is what the moon god is, another pagan god. And Azariah, his name meant Jehovah has helped. His Babylonian name, Abednego, means servant of Nebo, which is again a pagan god. So this is the first thing they did, and of course they're providing them food and everything, and they're providing them with education. But in verse 8 it says, but Daniel purposed his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now the Hebrew word translated purposed means to set something or to determine something or to resolve, to do something. And so Daniel is resolving he's going to do something in his life. He is not going to defile himself. This means he's not going to be unclean or impure. He's not going to do things that will cause him to go backwards. For the Hebrew people, defiling yourself could fall under 5 areas. You could be ceremonial defiled, ethnically, physically, religiously, or sexually. Daniel did not object to the schooling he was going to undergo, learning about the pagan gods, the different sciences of divination, about astrology. And he would learn to study mythology and the occult sciences. He didn't even object to his new name. But the law of Moses forbids food derived from the flesh of an unclean animal. The king's food undoubtedly contained or included meat that was by the law designated unclean. And the book of Proverbs counsels against drinking intoxicating wine. Daniel's refusal to eat the king's delicacies had nothing to do with the consumption of rich food or wine. There are basically the 2 problems that we mentioned. One is that the food is forbidden by the Mosaic dietary laws, and that food was not prepared according to the Mosaic regulations. The second part is that meat had probably been dedicated to idols. This was a custom in Babylon, that part of the food was dedicated to one of the various idols or deities. To eat the meat, if Daniel had eaten the meat, then he would have been recognizing that the idols were deities. So The main reason why Daniel and his companion refused to eat the food from Nebuchadnezzar's table was they were not prepared to break the Mosaic dietary laws, which in essence was being disobedient to God's laws. So verses 9 and 10 says, Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. What he's saying is that I am afraid of King Nebuchadnezzar. This is what he wants. If I don't do it and you guys, you and your friends get sick or get weak and the king sees it, the king's going to blame me. So the first part of that says God brought Daniel into his favor. God didn't abandon those who stood for him. This is what Daniel was doing. But in this case, he put Daniel into a favorable position to be a witness for the Lord. Proverbs 16:7 says, When the Lord takes pleasure in anyone's way, he causes their enemies to make peace with them. So, verses 11 through 13 says, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of eunuchs had set over Daniel. So you got the prince of the eunuchs. Now we got Melzar. You got Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He says, this is what Daniel's saying. Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, for 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink, and then our continence be looked upon before thee, and the continence of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. He puts up a proposition. He says, for 10 days, let us eat vegetables and drink water. And after 10 days, compare us with the children who have been eaten from the king's table. And if we have declined in our health, then deal with us appropriately. Verses 14 through 16 says, So he consented to them in this matter and proved them for 10 days. He gave them a 10-day test. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Then Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. Daniel made a reasonable request. He took a reasonable approach. He made a godly and wise compromise with the chief of the eunuchs. He did not compromise in an ungodly way, but he showed the wisdom that James 3:17 says. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceful, then gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. He could have gone on a hunger strike. He could have made some other kind of physical protest. But instead, he made a polite request. He made it to the right person and said, put us to the test. The 4 boys appeared healthier than those who had dined on the king's food, and so they were allowed to continue in their diet. Now, verse 17 says, As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had nothing in all visions. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God wanted these boys to be his witnesses in Babylon. He helped them become the best of the students. To Daniel, he gave a special ability to understand messages that were sometimes given in dreams. The king himself gave the final examination at the end of the 3 years of training. He found that the Hebrew boys not only were the best of the students, but also were even wiser than the great scholars of Babylon. Verses 19 through 21, And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even until the first years of King Cyrus. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and all the astrologers that were in his realm. Why? Verse 17. Go back to it. It says, As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. These 4 boys were taught these alien or pagan and ungodly ways. They'd never embraced them. For 3 years, they were taught, immersed in it. They never embraced him. They never converted to him. They remained true to the God of Israel in their hearts. They were in Babylon, but were not of Babylon. Verse 21 says, and Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. On this day, October 12th, or on October 12th, 539 BC, the Persian ruler Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. Cyrus is a king mentioned more than 30 times in the Bible and is identified as Cyrus the Great, also Cyrus the Second, Cyrus the Elder, who reigned over Persia from 539 to 530 BC. This pagan king is important in Jewish history because he, under his rule, allowed the Jews to return to Israel after 70 years of captivity. So he's very important. Now, the whole purpose of the first chapter of Daniel is to let us know, or to give us a clue that God is in control. In verse 2 it said, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hands of the Babylon. God did that. Nebuchadnezzar didn't beat him. Nebuchadnezzar was used by God, but it says the Lord gave. In verse 9 it says, the Lord brought Daniel into favor with the prince of eunuchs. The Lord brought him in there, put him in that position so that he had favor and he could make his request. In verse 17 it says, God gave them knowledge. So this is what the purpose of the first chapter is, to give us a clue that God is in control. This is what his plan is, and and this is how we're going to move, is with his plan. So that's the end of chapter 1. So here's your words of wisdom. As the smooth sea never made a smooth sailor. In other words, smooth sailing doesn't make a good sailor. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Thank you.